On December 23, 1944, at an aid station behind the Elsenborn Ridge in Belgium, a medic told a private first class named Bruce Glover to take off his boots. Glover didn't want to. He had been in a hole in the ground for days, in water, in a cold that never quite froze and never quite let go. And he had a feeling, he set it down in plain words long afterward, that if those boots came off, they were never going back on. He was right. His admission record still exists. Bruce D. Glover, serial number 36860891, 393rd Infantry. Diagnosis: trench foot. Condition: moderate. He remembered it later as the better part of 2 months. The paperwork tells a different story. Liège, then Paris, then a hospital in Birmingham, England. He was still in that bed on the 8th of May, 1945, the day the war in Europe ended. 4.5 months out of one pair of wet socks. Now hold on to the next detail, because it is the first sign that Glover was not unlucky. He was ordinary. Of the 35 men admitted alongside him that week, 18 carried the same diagnosis. Not 18 wounded, 18 with rotting feet. That same week, a few miles away, a lieutenant of the 1st Infantry Division named Preston Price had a visitor at his foxhole. Jack Lewis had been his classmate at the Citadel and now ran a company next door. And Lewis was complaining about the same thing he always complained about, that he couldn't feel his toes. He sat down. He worked his boot off, then the sock. Several of his toes came away inside it. Price watched a man he had known since he was a cadet look down at the bare bones of his own foot and understand, for the first time, what had been happening to him for a month. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the parts of this war that don't make the documentaries, a like and a subscribe help these men get found. The Army had a name for it: trench foot. The official term, chosen after the war, was cold injury, ground type. It isn't freezing. That's what made it so hard to see coming. It happens above freezing, in wet and cold, when the blood vessels close down and the tissue starves in place. And it doesn't hurt at first. It goes numb. Numb feels like relief. Here's the number, and I want you to sit with it before we go anywhere else. Between October of 1944 and April of 1945, 46,107 American soldiers in Europe were hospitalized for it. Let me put that in a shape you can hold. That is 3 full infantry divisions, deleted from the order of battle, without a single German firing a shot. 9.25% of every casualty the United States took in the entire campaign on the continent. And it did not fall evenly. Roughly 9 out of 10 of those men were frontline riflemen, the small fraction of an army that actually walks toward the enemy. In the worst week, the 7 days ending on the 17th of November, 5,386 men went down. The average man who went down lost 83 days. Most never came back to a rifle company at all. There were companies in Lorraine that November reduced to 14 men on their feet. There was a regiment that lost about 60% of its fighting strength and simply stopped attacking because there was nobody left to attack with. And in one battalion, men whose feet had swollen too badly to walk were carried by their friends up to the forward foxholes, so the line would still have somebody in it. That is the situation in December of 1944. And what happens next is the reason we're here. Because within weeks, across the whole American front, officers began doing something every single night. Not medics. Not just sergeants, officers. The men who sign for a company, who write the letters home when it goes wrong. It became their job, in writing, by order, with their names attached to the result. Men who had spent that day getting shelled in the Ardennes now spent part of that night on their knees in the mud with a red-lensed flashlight, examining other men's feet. It looks, at first glance, like the least military thing in this entire war. Within about 10 weeks, the number would collapse. Not improve, collapse. And I'll give you the exact figures later, because they're stranger than you'd expect. But here is what I could not get past when I started pulling the documents. The German army had already met this enemy. 3 winters earlier, in Russia, on a scale that makes Belgium look small. And they had the numbers, counted, tabulated, in hand. So they knew everything the Americans were about to learn, the hard way. And in the middle of that catastrophe, the German system produced a document of its own. It was not an order about feet. What was written in it explains more about the collapse of that American number than any boot, any sock, or any pair of galoshes ever shipped across the Atlantic. To understand how 46,000 men went down, you have to go back 13 months, to Italy. Because everything that happened in Belgium had already happened once, and been written down, and been filed. In December of 1943, Colonel Elliot Cutler walked through a row of hospital wards outside Naples. Cutler was the chief consultant in surgery for the entire European theater, and he had seen this disease before, in France, in 1917. The Fifth Army was drowning in it. Between September and April, more than 5,700 cases. In 1 week that February, over 900 men evacuated. For every 5 men carried out with wounds, 1 was carried out with feet. A major named Fiorindo Simeone was studying it, and he told Cutler that no more than a quarter of these men would ever return to duty. And Cutler looked at the feet, and Cutler wasn't impressed. In his war, trench foot had meant terrible swollen limbs, ulcers, the flesh gone blue. These feet didn't look like that. His recorded opinion, written down in his own diary, was that these soldiers were utilizing the pain very hard as a way out of fighting. I want you to sit with that, because it is the hinge of this entire story. The most senior surgical mind in the American war effort stood in front of the thing that would eventually cost 3 divisions and diagnosed cowardice. Now here's what changed him. Back in England, he fell into conversation with the chief surgical consultant to the Norwegian forces, a man who had just come out of Italy and who had also fought through the Russo-Finnish War. In Cutler's own estimate, that officer had more experience with cold, wet feet than any doctor then alive. Whatever was said between them, Cutler came away converted. On the 9th of April, 1944, 2 months before D-Day, he sent 3 findings up the chain. The socks issued to American soldiers didn't contain enough wool. American soldiers were invariably fitted with shoes that were too small. And the second one, remember this one because it comes back at the very end of this story, and it changes shape when it does. Rigid discipline, Cutler wrote, must be enforced within combat companies so that socks are changed daily, even if that means nothing more than wringing them out and putting them back on. There it is, 2 months before the invasion, in the right office, in writing. The answer. Watch what happens to it. A dermatologist named Donald Pillsbury had already reported the same warning from North Africa the previous November, urging that every facility of the chief surgeon's office be thrown at it. His notes on skin conditions and venereal disease were duly initialed and acted upon. On cold injury, nothing moved. On the 25th of April, a drafted circular titled Prevention of Trench Foot went forward. It was referred to another division. It stops there. On the 22nd of June, 16 days after the landings, Colonel John Gordon's office recommended a command directive called Care of the Feet. It specified how to fit boots over heavy socks. It gave instructions for drying socks when no dry pair existed. And it warned, explicitly, against lacing shoes tightly. It was disapproved by the Adjutant General of the theater, on the grounds that existing manuals already covered the subject, and that the problem was the responsibility of subordinate commands. Read that last phrase again. Not, this isn't real. Not, we can't afford it. The responsibility of subordinate commands. Somebody else's job. Hold that sentence. Everything that follows in this story is an argument with it. Why did nobody push? Because in the late summer of 1944, the armies were running across France, and a great many intelligent men believed the thing would be finished before Christmas. General Bradley called it a calculated risk, and he meant it literally. Ammunition and gasoline went forward, winter clothing waited. The first bulk requisition for winter gear left the theater on the 15th of August, the day southern France was invaded, and it was sized for one field army. 5 American field armies were fighting in Europe. The chief quartermaster gave definite assurances that no further requirements would be submitted. And then there's the detail I genuinely cannot get out of my head. As late as the 31st of October, with men already going down in the mud, instructions went out to pack light and dark trousers separately so they wouldn't be issued indiscriminately and spoil the uniform look of the troops. 1 million wool jackets sat in warehouses in the United Kingdom that winter because the trousers that matched them, shade 33, hadn't arrived yet. Men were losing toes in Belgium. The jackets were in England, waiting for their pants to match. So what were the soldiers actually told? The Manual of Therapy, issued a month before D-Day, prescribed a foot bath with soap and water, 20 minutes of massage, dry socks, and a change of shoes. For men under mortar fire in a flooded hole in the ground. And one instruction more, repeated in print, passed down to companies all year. Lace the shoes tightly. That autumn, the chief surgeon of the European theater finally went and examined the ruined feet himself, looking for a cause nobody had nailed down. He found it. It was pressed into the skin. What Major General Paul Hawley found, sunk deep into the swollen tissue of men's feet, were the marks of their own shoelaces. Not the cold, not the water, the lacing. The men had done what the manual told them, tightly, conscientiously, because they were good soldiers, and every one of those laces had been a tourniquet, slowly closing off the blood to a foot that needed that blood to survive the night. The army had printed the instruction. The men had obeyed it. The instruction had been maiming them since October. Hawley, who had 30 years in uniform, gave his verdict on American footwear in one sentence, and it wasn't a diplomatic sentence. The plain truth, he wrote, is that the footwear furnished U.S. troops is, in general, lousy. Here's why the lace marks were only half the wound. The service shoe was cut so scantily across the top that when a man wore heavy socks, there was no room between the wool and the leather. The uppers couldn't be drawn together by lacing without harmful constriction, and that was true even of a shoe that fitted correctly. Hawley remarked that in 3 decades of Army service, he had seldom seen shoes fitted with the care the job deserved. Then it got worse in a way nobody planned. A man's feet spread during training. The shoe that fit him as a civilian didn't fit him as a soldier. Wet leather shrank, so the shoe got tighter still. And when he pulled it off to care for his foot, the foot swelled, and now he couldn't get it back on. So he stopped taking it off. That is the trap, and it's worth saying plainly. The single most important preventive measure in this entire war was a man removing his boots. And the army had issued him a boot that punished him for doing it. The numbers show you exactly what it cost. During November, the 9th Army's worst rates fell on the 84th and 102nd Divisions. Only 35% of those men had overshoes. Between them, those 2 divisions accounted for over 62% of every trench foot case in the entire Army by the 22nd of the month. 2 divisions, 2/3 of an army's losses, because of rubber galoshes. And yet, and this is where it stops being a supply story, the galoshes weren't the answer either. At the 108th General Hospital, someone had the sense to start interviewing the casualties as they came in, not counting them, asking them. In the week ending the 27th of November, 82 men in every 100 had lacked overshoes or received them too late. Fine. Predictable. Now the part that isn't predictable. Of the men in that same 100 who did have overshoes and were wearing them, only 18 had managed to keep their feet dry. 18. The following weeks it was 2, then 11. So the equipment was not the answer. It helped. It was not the answer. Something else was doing the work, and the men in the holes had already figured out what it was, months before any general did. They were solving it themselves, in the dark, with whatever was lying around. Art Broadhurst, a combat engineer with the 75th Division, had boots that took up water like a sponge, and overshoes that let snow in over the top. He found a sheepskin hanging in a barn, cut himself a pair of moccasins to wear inside the galoshes, and threw his army boots away. James Langford, a rifleman in the 99th, couldn't get his overshoes over his shoes at all during the first days of the Bulge. So he wore 4 buckles and 3 or 4 pairs of socks and no shoes whatsoever. In the same division, William McMurdy watched a sergeant in his platoon go through the winter in 7 pairs of socks and nothing else. Barefoot, essentially, inside a rubber galosh. In Belgian snow. And here's the thing that should stop you. The Army's own medical historians later concluded those men were right. Discarding the tight boot and packing the overshoe with 6 or 8 pairs of wool was among the best protections available, because the toes could finally move. Not warmer, looser. Everything the institution had gotten wrong, the private in the hole had reverse-engineered from pain. Others stuffed straw and newspaper into their galoshes. The paratroopers at Bastogne wrapped their feet in foraged burlap sacks. Some men used the white silk powder bags that came packed with 155mm shells. Extremely effective, and there were never enough of them. And all along that front, GIs were stripping the thick felt and leather winter boots off German dead, because to the American infantryman, rightly or wrongly, whatever he saw on a German was assumed to be better than his own. So by mid-December, the situation was this. The men knew what worked. The generals did not. And nothing connected the two. Then a full major of the United States Army took off his rank, put on a private's uniform, and walked into a rifle company under a false identity, to find out what his own soldiers knew that his own headquarters didn't. On the 30th of January, 1945, an infantry replacement reported to the headquarters of L Company, 310th Infantry, 78th Division, near Kozen inside Germany. He was older than the others. That was the only thing about him worth a second look. He had a rifle and a duffel and no history anyone asked about, and the men of the company took him for what he appeared to be, another warm body sent up to fill a hole in the line. He was Major Arthur Goodfriend, an editor of Stars and Stripes. A handful of senior officers knew. Nobody in the company did. He had gotten himself deliberately misidentified as a private so he could find out, from inside a rifle company, how the American soldier was actually surviving the winter. Because the Army's published account and the Army's casualty lists had stopped agreeing with each other. Understand what the official line was at that moment. That same week, American newspapers were running stories about doughboys hobbling on frozen feet. Newsweek had just published a piece titled Shades of Valley Forge on the failures of the Quartermaster Corps, noting that regulation shoes kept out neither cold nor damp, and that the resulting trench foot could lead to gangrene and amputation. General Eisenhower's headquarters dismissed the reports as isolated cases. Goodfriend went to find the isolated cases. What he found first was a forward command post with men crowded around a wood stove. No overcoats, because the overcoats had long since been thrown away for being too heavy to fight in. Field jackets only, gloves out at the fingers. Several men had pulled socks over their hands. These were the soldiers that Army publicity was at that moment describing as the best equipped in the world. He was a new man, so the veterans took him in hand. And this is the part I find remarkable. There was a curriculum, not a printed one, Wear 2 or 3 pairs of socks, but not so many that the boot goes tight, because tight is how you lose the foot. Watch out, though, they told him, because most of our shoes are too tight anyway, and when they fill with water, they get smaller still. Put a felt or cardboard pad in your overshoes. Don't throw the overshoes away, whatever the others tell you. An entire body of survival knowledge, accurate, hard-won, and transmitted mouth-to-mouth by privates, the same knowledge that Colonel Cutler had put in a memorandum 9 months earlier and watched disappear into a filing system. The men had no idea a colonel had ever written it. They'd worked it out themselves, from the inside, at the cost of their own toes. Goodfriend also collected the verdicts. The consensus on the combat boot was that it was rotten. His own battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, a man responsible for 800 lives, told him flatly that the people who made that boot ought to be put in jail. And he recorded something else, which matters more than the equipment. The premature announcements, the stories about vast quantities of winter gear in the rear, or on the ocean, or in production back home, had done real damage. They had depressed the frontline soldiers' morale and, in Goodfriend's words, weakened his respect for the army. That is the true crisis of that winter, and it isn't a supply crisis. An infantryman will accept almost anything. He will accept that there are no boots. What he will not accept is being told there are boots. The gap between the announcement and the foxhole was where the trust was dying. And an army whose riflemen have stopped believing, it is an army that has lost something it cannot requisition. You can see it in one exchange. Around that same time, a soldier in the 84th Division named Mike Churko was finally issued shoe packs, the good boot, the one that worked, arriving at last. The next day, his unit was ordered to turn them back in and take the combat boots again. The reason given? Now that winter was over, the shoe packs would slow them down. It was the 20-something of January. There was snow on the ground. Meanwhile, the disease was doing arithmetic on the whole front. In that first week of the Bulge, of every 100 men admitted with cold injury at the 108th General Hospital, only 46 still had an adequate supply of socks, 3 pairs. The week after, 42. The Army's own historians added the detail that gets left out of every chart. Many of the men who did have dry socks simply couldn't put them on because of what was happening around them. But somebody in a hospital had noticed something in those interviews, something small, and it changed the arithmetic entirely. A large share of the men arriving at aid stations with apparent cold injury didn't need a hospital at all. They needed to get warm and put on a dry pair of socks. That was it. That was the whole treatment, which meant a man could be saved for his company by 10 minutes and a pair of socks, or lost to the war for 83 days, depending entirely on whether someone made him take his boots off in time. And that raised the question the American Army had been avoiding since April. Whose job was it to make him? The first man to answer that question in public was, of all people, George Patton, and he answered it in a way nobody expected on the 21st of November, 1944. His Third Army had already issued a directive on the 9th. It hadn't worked. So Patton wrote to his commanders himself, and the letter opens with a sentence that reads strangely even now. The most serious menace confronting us today, he wrote, is not the German army, which we have practically destroyed, but the weather, which, if we do not exert ourselves, may well destroy us through the incidents of trench foot. Read it again with the date in mind. Late November, 1944. Patton is telling his generals that the greatest threat to the Third Army is not the Wehrmacht. He wasn't wrong. For the week ending the 25th of November, for every 100 battle casualties evacuated from his army, 60 more men were evacuated with cold injury. The medical officer who carried that figure to him added the assessment that trench foot was doing quite as much damage to the Allied cause as the enemy was, because of how long the disability lasted and how readily it came back. 60 for every 100. From an army that was, at that moment, attacking. Now, that letter didn't fix it. I want to be honest about that, because the tidy version of this story would have Patton write a memo and the epidemic stop. It didn't. Cases in the Third Army had already peaked and were falling for reasons that had as much to do with the weather as with him. In December, the whole thing came roaring back in a different form, as frostbite, when the ground froze during the Ardennes offensive. 3,213 cases in the week ending the 29th of December alone. What the letter did was something else. It moved the problem across a line inside the Army's own head. Trenchfoot stopped being a medical subject and became a command subject, the thing a general answers for. And the Army had a way of finding out whether that was true, because it had been quietly running a natural experiment all winter without meaning to. Here it is. Some divisions had consistently good records. Some had records that were almost consistently bad. And here's the key, regardless of how hard they were fighting. Combat activity did not tell the whole story. When investigators went into the bad divisions, they almost invariably found conditions that could be improved. Same theater, same weather, same lousy boots, same shortage of galoshes. Wildly different numbers. Which meant the variable was not the equipment. The variable was the command. The clearest case was the 30th Infantry Division, 1st Army, an old, seasoned outfit whose commanders had understood the danger long before anybody sent them a directive about it. The Army's official history describes what they had built with a phrase worth keeping: a well-developed system of foot discipline. And the result was that only when the tactical situation was entirely beyond control did that division take appreciable losses from cold. Not because they were issued better gear. They weren't. The 30th didn't receive shoe packs and winter equipment in quantity until after their part in the Battle of the Bulge was finished. So look at what one of their regimental commanders did instead. Colonel Branner Perdue had the 120th Infantry in the snow, reducing the Bulge salient with no proper winter footwear coming. So he stopped waiting for the Quartermaster Corps and had booties made, cut roughly to the shape of a combat boot, sewn 3 layers thick out of salvaged blankets and blankets captured off the Germans. American soldiers went through that winter with the enemy's bedding wrapped around their feet because their own army's supply chain had lost an argument about trouser shades. They were light enough that a man carried his inside his shirt, where his body kept them dry and warm until the moment he needed them. Gus Roof, a mortarman in the regiment, did exactly that, carried them against his chest, and when things went quiet, pulled off his soaked boots, let them dry, and put the booties on inside his overshoes. There is no doubt, he wrote, that they saved many of us from getting trench feet. By the middle of January, there were enough for every man in the regiment, and for every replacement, handed over on arrival. The 8th, the 78th, and the 44th Divisions started copying them. The Army's own medical history eventually acknowledged blanket booties inside overshoes as one of the best forms of protection developed in the entire theater, precisely because the toes could move. A colonel with a sewing operation had outperformed the Quartermaster General of the United States Army. And then, in January, all of it, Perdue's booties, the 30th's foot discipline, Patton's letter, got taken away from the individual commanders who invented it and turned into something the whole theater had to do, every night, whether they believed in it or not. Which is when the American Army did the thing that the German Army, with 3 more winters of experience, had never once attempted. In January of 1945, the prevention of cold injury became, across every American army in Europe, a command responsibility. Those 3 words are the answer to the question the Adjutant General had ducked in June, when he wrote that the problem belonged to subordinate commands. Now it belonged to a specific person, with a name and a rank, in every company on the line. Here is what it looked like on the ground. The men were instructed, actually instructed, which most of them never had been. Remember, in the Italian epidemic the year before, of 320 men studied with trenchfoot, 59% had never received any instruction in preventing it. In one sample of 142 men interviewed at a clearing station, Not a single one had been taught what he was risking by sleeping in the cold without changing his wet socks. Not one in 142. Second, a supply chain was built for one item. Clean, dry socks moved forward with the daily rations, in the ration jeeps, in the ration sleds. A man drew his food and his socks together and handed back the wet pair. When the tactical situation broke that, he was to wring out what he had and dry it against his own skin inside his shirt. Third, control teams. Small groups whose job was to go into units and enforce it, and to sit down with the divisions whose numbers were bad and work out why. And fourth, the thing this whole story turns on. Somebody had to physically look. Every night, in the dark, in the line, at the feet of men who did not want to take their boots off, because taking them off hurt, and because they might not go back on. Officers and sergeants knelt in the mud with red-lensed flashlights and checked, one man at a time, for the color and the swelling that meant a soldier had about a day left before he cost the United States 83 of them. Now, why is that the thing no German would touch? Not because German soldiers didn't care about their feet. They did. They had winter manuals. They had Fußlappen, the issued foot wraps that a man wound around his foot instead of a sock, and which the manual insisted were warmer than socks. A German artilleryman named Franz Fritsch remembered that he was never issued socks at all, only wraps, and that his family sent him socks from home because wraps and socks both wore out. And the German army knew this disease far better than the American army did. In the winter of 41 and 42, in Russia, they took something on the order of 100,000 frostbite casualties. Nearly 15,000 men lost limbs. Reported figures for trench foot in the German army that same winter run to 250,000. 250,000. Against 46,000 Americans 3 winters later. So they had the experience, they had the data, they had, in fact, counted it. Which brings us to the German document. On the 21st of February 1942, with the Eastern Front frozen solid and men dying of exposure in front of Moscow, the Nazi Party issued an instruction to its public speakers. Confidential. Guidance on what to say. It begins by stating that the rumors circulating about severe hardship among the troops in the East lack any foundation. Such difficulties as exist are the ordinary, unavoidable difficulties of winter, so minor, given the length and depth of the front, as to be of no significance. The rumors, it explains, most likely originate in enemy propaganda, intended to damage the world's view of the German defense and to weaken the confidence of the German people. Then comes the sentence I keep returning to. The Wehrmacht at the front, it says, and the administrative offices in the occupied territories have tabulated the cases of frostbite. These figures prove that all the chatter is exaggerated. And then, whether and when the figures are released to the public depends on strategic considerations. They had the number. They just weren't going to say it. The directive goes further. Speakers were told to combat the talk energetically. When people cited sources, doctors, orderlies, Red Cross nurses, mayors who had seen the amputees in the hospitals, speakers were to demand written proof, whereupon the rumor mongers would fall silent, being unable to support their irresponsible chatter. Understand what that instruction does. Somewhere in Germany, there is a nurse who has spent the winter cutting frozen feet off 19-year-olds. The party's official guidance is that she is careless, gullible, and probably repeating enemy propaganda, and that a party speaker should say so to her face. Now put the two systems side by side, because they were solving the same problem. The Americans counted, published, argued, and blamed themselves. The Germans counted, sealed it, and instructed the nation to disbelieve its own hospitals. But that's still not the whole answer, because there is one more American document from that winter, and it reveals that a serious faction inside the United States Army wanted to do something to these men that was closer to the German instinct than anyone likes to remember. The argument was about a medal. Army Regulation 645, dated the 3rd of May, 1944, laid out who received the Purple Heart. An injury to any part of the body from an outside force, element, or agent sustained as the result of a hostile act of the enemy, or while in action in the face of the enemy. That word in the middle, element. Somebody read it and realized that weather is an element, and that a man whose feet had rotted off in a hole in Belgium while facing the German army had, by the plain text of the regulation, qualified. The army fought about it for months, and the position that emerged against it went like this. Cold injury is preventable. A preventable injury is not an honorable wound. Therefore, these men should not be decorated. Some officers went further. The record notes that some suggested that soldiers with trench foot should rather be punished. There it is, the same instinct in an American uniform. The disease is the soldier's fault. Charge him. That instinct did not win. And the reason it did not win is the actual answer to everything we have been circling for the last hour. Because trench foot was preventable, that part was true. The General Board that studied the whole catastrophe after the war stated it flatly. Cold injury, ground type, is to a great extent preventable. And they listed why it had happened anyway. Inadequate clothing and footgear, unfavorable operational conditions, and the delay of many units in instituting a program with emphasis on and close supervision of the measures to be taken by the individual soldier. Look at where the blame lands in that sentence. Not on the individual soldier, on the units that were slow to supervise him. That is the whole thing. That is the entire difference. Both armies agreed the disease was preventable. The question was, who had failed to prevent it? And the two systems gave opposite answers. In the German system, the man in the hole was responsible for his own body, and the institution's response to its own casualty figures was to classify them and instruct the public to disbelieve the nurses. The soldier's rotting foot was his private failure, and the state's problem was the rumor. In the American system, by January of 1945, that foot had become an officer's failure, measured, reported weekly, compared between divisions, attached to a commander's name. And once you have decided that a private's feet are a captain's responsibility, the nightly inspection isn't sentimental. It's just what that decision looks like when you carry it out to the end. Somebody has to kneel down in the mud and actually look, because somebody upstairs has agreed to be answerable for what's found. That is the thing no German would touch. Not the foot, the accountability. And here's how you know it was real, rather than a story the Americans told afterward. They published the indictment against themselves. The official medical history of the United States Army, printed by the Surgeon General, available to anyone, says that the fundamental and all-pervading reason for the epidemic was that the lessons of the past had not been learned or heeded. It says that if the premise is accepted that cold injury is largely preventable, there is no real excuse for what happened. No real excuse. About their own war. In their own book. It names the theater chief quartermaster who refused the better clothing. It records that requisitions were too small and too late, based on poor planning and wishful thinking. It preserves Colonel Cutler's opinion that the men in Italy were faking, so that everyone can see how badly he got it wrong before he got it right. Now compare the two documents one final time. Germany, February 42. The figures exist, and their release depends on strategic considerations. The United States, 1958. Here are the figures. Here are the names. Here is precisely how we failed our own infantry, and let it serve as a warning for all future operations. One army protected its reputation from its casualties. The other protected its casualties by publishing its reputation. And in the winter of 1944, in the mud, one of those two habits turned into a man with a flashlight, on his knees, in front of a 19-year-old's bare feet. So did it work? Here is the curve, week by week, and I've been holding it back for 6 parts because it only means something now. The peak, 5,386, in the week ending the 17th of November. Through January, never fewer than 3,000 a week. Then the week ending the 16th of February, 1,643. The following week, 596. By the week ending the 30th of March, 108. The entire month of April for 3 million men, 230. From 5,000 a week to 100. And there is a bitter, honest complication in that collapse that the army itself insisted on recording. One that turns the whole triumph sideways. Here's the complication, and the Army's own historians put it in writing rather than let anyone believe a cleaner story. By the time the shoe packs arrived in quantity, by the time the wool socks and the properly sized overshoes and the M1943 jackets finally came ashore, by the time the trench foot program was running in every division, the weather had broken. The thaw came. The fighting eased. Temperatures rose. The supplies and the program and the spring all arrived at roughly the same moment, and no honest man can hand the whole of that collapse to any one of them. The official verdict is brutal in its plainness. They came too late to be entirely useful. So the men who died of it before anybody fixed anything. That is simply true, and the United States Army wrote it down about itself and printed it. But something did change that could not be undone by weather. 46,107 men hospitalized, 3 infantry divisions, 83 days apiece for those who came back at all, and most did not come back to a rifle company. Not one of them shot. And out of that, an institution learned that the body of a private first class is an asset the institution is accountable for. The lessons then learned, the official history notes, shaped the preparations for the war expected in Japan and the Far East. They shaped Korea. The buddy check, the sock discipline, the officer who looks. All of it comes out of that winter, and it is still in the manuals now, 80 years on, written in the toes of men from Nebraska and Missouri and New Jersey. Bruce Glover left the hospital in Birmingham on the 8th of May, 1945, the day the war in Europe ended. He came home. He told his family about it in his own words, decades later, and because he did, his admission record and his 4.5 months are in this story instead of lost. Preston Price survived and wrote his own account, which is how we know what happened to Jack Lewis's toes inside that sock. Murray Pulver, the company commander in Purdue's regiment, was wearing his blanket booties inside his overshoes during an attack when a German grenade landed under his right foot and exploded. The overshoe was blown to pieces. The 3 layers of salvaged blanket absorbed the rest. He walked away with a bruise, and he lived to write it down. Gus Roof came home too, and published his account of the road from Holland to the Rhine, and made sure the booties were in it. And on the 20th of January 1945, at a place called Gérimont in Belgium, an army photographer stopped 3 men of the 30th Division taking a 10-minute break by a small fire. Sergeant Albert Soley of Westwood, California, Private Jimmy Ferguson of Granby, Missouri, Technical Sergeant Robert Kircher of Maplewood, New Jersey. Ferguson is holding up his booties for the camera. 3 layers of blanket, cut to the shape of a boot, and he is showing them off like a man showing off a new car. That is what victory looked like that January. Not a tank. A private from Missouri, grinning, holding a piece of German bedding that his colonel had sewn into a boot so that he would still have feet in the spring. The answer to all of it is smaller than you'd think, and it isn't about boots at all. An army that will kneel down in the mud and look at a private's feet has already decided that the private matters more than the army's dignity. And an army that will publish the number of feet it ruined has already decided that the truth matters more than the army's reputation. That was the thing the other side would not touch, and it beat them. Thank you for staying with me. No tanks, no aces, no famous last stands. If you made it here, it's because you understand that armies are won and lost in things this small. A like genuinely helps this reach people who've never been told any of it. Subscribe and ring the bell, and I'll keep digging into the parts of this war that got left out. And tell me where you're watching from. If your father or grandfather served in an American outfit, give me his name and unit. And if he came home from that winter with feet that never felt right again, say so. A great many did, and they mostly never said much about it. Somebody should.